A staple of science fiction is the super soldier. A person who was once just a regular fella like you and me, taken and pumped full of all sorts of stuff, given the best armor available, and then told to get out there and start taking names. Space Marines are the premier example you probably think of, given that this is mostly a Warhammer channel. Clan Elementals from Battletech are another standout, since they were so thoroughly effective the Inner Sphere thought they were aliens at first, because no foot soldier should be able to tank around from a mech and keep going. But for me and many others, the most iconic super soldier isn't one of these or any other number of examples you can think of. It's the Spartans of Halo. Men and women jacked up on all sorts of enhancements as children, told to complete the mission at any cost, and accidentally becoming the saviors of humanity along the way. And there's a lot going on with them. The Spartans of Halo are more than just the Master Chief or Noble Team. There's a history to them that's interesting to talk about and look at. Because it's been a while since I've last gushed over Halo, let's look at the history of the Spartans, everyone's favorite orphan super soldiers. One thing about Spartans before we begin though is that they had the best armor around. And while you probably can't get yourself authentic Mjolnir armor, you can get yourself some of the finest athletics wear around with Fabletics, the sponsor of this video. Fabletics, like I said, makes the best athletic wear around. Because Fabletics makes clothes that aren't just suited to running, sports, or anything else. They look and feel good too. Case in point, my favorite outfit I've been sent yet. The fundamental hat, year-round terry hoodie, 24/7 tee, and year-round terry shorts. It looks nice so you can wear it wherever, and it feels great so you can throw it on anytime. Clues in the name after all, this bad boy's great any time of the year. It's nice and light too, so you aren't going to be sweating to death in the summer heat. And with the VIP program, you can get this and plenty more fantastic outfits. As a nice way to welcome you in, it gives you 80% off on the whole site, which is a great deal if I've heard of one. You can save up to 50% daily as a VIP, and each month you even get a free credit for a 2-piece outfit or any other product up to $100. All of this is to say nothing of how you can get early access to outfits, monthly drops, and plenty more with a VIP membership. But I know the money talks, so how about I sweeten things up a bit for you? If you use my link in the description and pinned comment, you can get not only all of those wonderful deals above on these fantastic outfits, but 80% off the entire damn site when you sign up to be a VIP. 80%! 4/5. That's a lot of money saved on the best athletics wear you can find. So what are you waiting for? Sign up for Fabletics today so you can look and feel your very best. Now then, it's time to shoot our way out, mix things up a bit. The Spartan project does not begin with the Master Chief and all the other Spartan IIs. The clue to that is in the name. He's a Spartan II. For there to be a second version of something, there has to have been a first. This is groundbreaking stuff I'm presenting to you right now, and it only gets better, trust me. The first iteration of the Spartans was in the Orion project, which initially was only ever referred to as such. The Spartan II project caused it to be retroactively named the Spartan I project, but the soldiers here were all known as Orions. Its origins were actually in the 2300s, with at least 5 test subjects taken in to be part of Phase 1. Prior to this, there were a few small examples of chemical enhancements given to soldiers, and while they were only a step above giving a dude PCP and telling him to go nuts, they proved that creating super soldiers was a viable option for the military. The project, however, was shelved due to lack of funding, poor results, and just generally being kind of shit all around. The augmented soldiers were all reintegrated back into the military, so it couldn't have gone that badly, but they also all died within a year due to undisclosed reasons. When the Office of Naval Intelligence is refusing to disclose reasons, that's code for everyone involved being taken out behind the shed and shot. Anything beyond that is lost to time, because between the data on the original project deteriorating and people stealing it, people probably also being Oni, much of it is no longer available. It did also pave the way for things like adrenaline injections and other minor enhancements to become standard for UNSC troops, so if you ever wondered why research in the first Halo Wars was to start juicing your soldiers to make them run faster, now you know. In the late 2400s, humanity was on the brink of a much more mundane catastrophe than what would come about in 30-odd years. The outer colonies of humanity wanted to be independent from the United Earth government, and the UEG did not want them to be independent. Insurrectionist movements of all types were springing up, and they ranged from protests to outright terrorism. With the insurrection gaining steam fast, Project Orion was relaunched on January 29th, 2491. Given that a year from then, the best solution the UNSC had to prevent rebellion was to nuke an entire colony to ash, some important people felt maybe giving super soldiers another go would be a good idea. Less collateral damage at the very least. From the best of the UNSC Marines and Special Forces units were, surprisingly enough, volunteer forces, taken to be made better than what anyone could hope to be without a bit of genetic magic. Based on where else but the planet Reach, since Reach was kind of a big deal prior to getting obliterated, these soldiers were taken in to become part of Project Orion. One notable member was none other than Sergeant Avery Johnson. If you thought he was just a bit too badass to be a regular person, you're right, he was a Spartan I. Beginning with 65 volunteers and eventually reaching a peak of 300 soldiers, Project Orion was a mixed bag, though far more successful than the first time around. The augmentations were hell on everyone involved, with Johnson describing it as agonizing while also sending him into confused fits of rage. Once that little stumbling block was passed, however, the Orions were quite effective in combat. They proved key in a variety of operations against insurrectionist movements, and were pretty good all around. The issues that arose were twofold. One is that pretty good wasn't good enough. While Orions were all better than unaugmented humans, without an in-depth examination, you weren't able to tell them apart from normal dudes. The project basically took normal soldiers and made them slightly better than your average ODST. ODSTs are awesome, but that wasn't the level of effectiveness the UNSC was looking for. And all the while, the insurrection was only getting worse, with more civilians being caught in the crossfire and feelings turning more and more against the UNSC. The UNSC needed the ultimate soldier, and all Project Orion gave them was really good soldiers. The other major issue is that many Orions also suffered irreversible genetic damage. It caused physical and mental degradation, substantially reducing their quality of life, and worst of all for the UNSC's purposes, degrading their performance in combat. While not every Orion suffered from it, most notably again Avery Johnson, enough did that Oni fabricated a disease known as Boren syndrome to explain why several hundred soldiers were suddenly starting to melt. It's not all bad though. None of the Orions got the same treatment as those first 5 did, instead being quietly reassigned back to the regular military as the project was ended in 2506. They even inspired the ODSTs to be heavily restructured, turning them into the badasses we know from the games. One final legacy the Spartan ones had was their children. While it's never confirmed, it's hinted that the children of Spartan ones had their own augmentations given shortly after birth. While not anywhere near the level of the following Spartan generations or even their own Spartan 1 parents, they were nonetheless physically superior to baseline humans. 13 of them even formed their own mini-military group to fight the Covenant. Nothing super important, but given that it's not guaranteed they were augmented, it raises the possibility that these Spartan 1.1s as they were called could have been the start of breedable super soldiers. Which means thank God Oni didn't seem to pay them too much interest, because otherwise there undoubtedly would have been some pretty monstrous shit going on there. But with them out of the way, now it's time for the good stuff. The Spartan IIs. While Project Orion was created and then decommissioned, a report known as the Carver Findings was published. It stated that unless the situation with the insurrection was resolved quickly, humanity was on the brink of total war between the inner and outer colonies. Dr. Halsey, scientist and all-around pretty bad human being, added her own report to the mix stating it was even worse than that. Mankind was on the brink of potentially sending itself back to the Stone Age, Age of Strife style, and at the least, billions were going to die. Plenty of people were skeptical of this, and quite frankly, I think it's a bit out there as well, but Oni is among other things incredibly paranoid. Whether or not it would have ultimately been true is irrelevant, because Oni believed it to be true. So she was brought on to Oni Section 3, the Special Projects branch, and in 2511 they got to work on continuing what the Orion Project began. The goal this time around was to create super soldiers to throw at any insurrectionist cells in their infancy. The idea was that you'd have a couple of moderately important people going, hey, maybe we should break away from the UNSC, and then super soldiers would storm into their meeting and blow them up before it could escalate into full-blown warfare. For the record, this has to be violating some sort of human rights convention, but Halo gets pretty grim sometimes. It is what it is. The criteria for the Spartan IIs is what led to them all being kidnapped children. They already needed to be young enough for their augmentations to be accepted by their bodies, but Oni also wanted soldiers that would only ever be soldiers. No questioning of orders or wondering if what they were doing was right. As far as they were concerned, total collapse was on the line, so all morals were promptly thrown out the window. They also needed to be as close to perfect as you could get. No history of disease or anything like that in their family, and the kid needed a competitive and go-getter spirit. The kind of thing that would make a kid the protagonist of some cheesy coming-of-age movie if they weren't about to have their lives stolen from them by shadowy government agents. So Oni set out, found 156-year-old children, which was later cut down to 75 children, and kidnapped them. Their family names were erased, and they were only ever referred to by their first name and a number. Those kids were then put through special ops grade training regiments, pushing them to their absolute limit. Chief Petty Officer Franklin Mendez oversaw the training, and he put them through the ringer. Day after day, the most grueling training imaginable happened to them, and Mendez was oftentimes a brutal teacher. In spite of Oni wanting brainwashed soldiers, he did also make sure to do his best to instill duty, honor, and respect into the Spartans, trying to teach them between right and wrong as well as how to kill. I'm sure this was all overseen by Oni, of course, to make sure the weapons and training wouldn't have too many moral objections to murdering civilians. The Spartans, for their part, would come to consider each other as family, having an almost telekinetic bond with each other from how familiar they became with their fellows. This all came to a head when the Spartans reached the age of 14 and 25, when they would receive the augmentations that would make them true super soldiers. Now remember how in the Orion project, Avery Johnson described it as agonizing, and how those augmentations were ultimately only a slightly noticeable boost to their effectiveness? We'll take those, double them a few more times, and instead of it being done to trained soldiers, it's being done to children. Despite being completely unconscious, the Spartan candidates were wrought with intense agony. Each of the augmentations they received had its own special kind of pain, which makes me wonder if they ever got into arguments over which augmentation was the worst. Out of the 75 children selected, 30 of them straight up died. 12 more were crippled to the point of being unable to function, and were put into cryostasis in the hopes that they'd be able to be rehabilitated in future years. Only 33 survived the process and came out as proper Spartan IIs. While all this was going on, the Spartans were replaced with flash clones to avoid suspicion. Cloning in Halo for the UNSC is rather less than perfect. The clones start deteriorating the moment they're made, and after a few years they had all died of technically natural causes. This prevented anyone from finding out about the whole mass kidnapping of children thing, although at the very least the father of one Spartan, now Emi-10, was convinced that his daughter was still alive out there and became an insurrectionist as a result. The head of ONI called Catherine Halsey out for this, saying she only did it to ease her own conscience. Whether or not that's true, having a handy excuse to explain away kidnapping 75 children seems like a good thing to have to hand. I can only assume that Margaret Parangoski was angry at Halsey because the whole thing was an act of subterfuge ONI wasn't involved in, and therefore was wrong in their eyes. Also, 2 of the surviving Spartans killed themselves after coming into contact with their flash clones. This video sure is cheery, isn't it? Anyways, tempting as it is to send you all to another video I listed all these augmentations in so I have less work to do, that's a level of laziness I haven't quite reached yet. So I'll speedrun it instead here, because let's be honest, listing off augmentations is a bit dry. Material was grafted to their bones to make them basically unbreakable, muscle tissue was made more dense, and lactic acid recovery time was significantly reduced, which means Spartans get no post-workout ouchies. A pellet was put in their thyroid gland, which boosts the growth of skeletal and muscle tissue. They dicked around with the blood vessels in their eyes to let them see far better, and they messed with their nervous system so as to increase reaction time by 300%, with unconfirmed reports of increases in intelligence, memory, and creativity. It's worth keeping in mind that these are the results when the Spartans were 14 years old. By the time they reached full maturity towards the end of their teens and into their early 20s, this was all going to only get more and more extreme. Very few of them were under 6.5 feet tall, with some such as George towering above everyone around them at over 7 feet without the armor. To put how effective they were into perspective, the Master Chief, after his augmentations had settled, was working out at a military gym, and the entire time he felt off. Not weaker, just that everything was wrong. It got to the point he was checking machines to see if they were broken, and at one point he dropped a weight and calculated how fast it was falling because to him, it looked like it was dropping in slow motion. Then some real cocky ODSTs came in and started being rude to the Chief. This ended with John and those 4 ODSTs in a boxing ring, which subsequently ended with 4 crippled or dead ODSTs. One of which John kicked so hard in the balls his hips exploded. I'm not making that up. At age 14, Spartans were mopping the floor with the best soldiers mankind had to offer, and they weren't done growing yet. I don't even just mean that in a metaphorical way, like with the experience of battle and whatnot. Puberty doesn't end at 14. These bastards had at least a couple more years of physical growth in them. Their psychology was also the sort of thing a shrink would have nightmares over. Oni initially just wanted to brainwash the poor kids, but Halsey objected. While they were weapons, they were also soldiers and needed to understand the gravity of the missions they were sent on. Certainly still some brainwashing, but less so now. They commonly stuck together and frequently avoided contact with non-Spartans, being a bit alienated from the common man. They didn't hold what happened to them against anyone, they thought of it as both necessary and what they were born to do, which is one of the most depressing things I've read in a while. That being said, the trauma of what was done to them and the enemy they'd soon face would weigh down on them, as it would anyone. Speaking of the average person though, Spartans were generally regarded with a mix of reverence and disgust. Because on the one hand, when a 7-foot-tall maniac comes rocketing out of nowhere to rip a brute in half just as it's about to turn your entire squad into a stain on the ground, a bit of hero worship is going to be natural. On the other hand, the Spartans are described almost like the Eldar are over in 40k. They move with a grace and precision that feels almost unnatural, like they crawled right out of the uncanny valley. They made people feel uncomfortable to the point that many people were afraid of touching a Spartan, also sort of like how Eldar view Harlequin solitaires. ODSTs in particular felt bitter about the Spartans, feeling like they were getting all the glory while the ODSTs did the true work, among other grievances. The Spartans for their part didn't really care about this. That was the sort of thing that wasn't related to the mission, so they just ignored it. They could interact with other humans normally on occasion, though. Fred 104 had a bit of a sense of humor, and even joked about how it was more of an operational bug than a feature once. And Jerome 092, who was actually one of the washouts but was able to be reintegrated and turned into a Spartan proper, was actually good friends with Sergeant Forge aboard the Spirit of Fire. They got into a fight on the mess hall of the ship once, which, according to Halo Wars, resulted in a broken chair, a hole in the bulkhead of the ship, and the shipboard AI having to tell both of them to knock it off. They would always eat together after that. As an aside, Jesus Christ, Forge, maybe it wasn't just bravado when you said you would have kicked his ass the first time if the lady hadn't stopped you. Man got into a fist fight with a Spartan and came away from it with a new lunch buddy instead of in a body bag. Also, I'm glad that Jerome has a history of using chairs in combat. After several iterations of the armor, they also finally received the Mark IV Mjolnir power armor towards the end of 2025. Marks 1 through 3 were prototypes that were ultimately flawed, with the Mark IV being the first one that could be feasibly used outside of testing. It weighs 1,000 pounds, has just about every single piece of military equipment you could think of inside of it, vacuum sealing, and a whole bunch of other sci-fi stuff to ensure that the decades-long investment inside the thing wouldn't bite the bullet the moment some random schmuck with a gun pointed it in their direction. It also significantly multiplied the strength, speed, and reactions of whoever was wearing it, something only Spartans could effectively handle. When a normal person got in it for testing, it boosted his movement so high he accidentally started breaking bones with how fast he was going. When he was twitching and spasming from the incredible pain he was in, the Mjolnir armor augmented those twitches and spasms until he eventually died because it made him so fast his body physically couldn't keep up with itself. Spartans were the only one capable of wearing Mjolnir without killing themselves, and it boosted them to even greater heights. This was very good timing, because in 2525 the Covenant decided that humanity as a whole had to bite the bullet. The Spartans prior to this had only partaken in one operation against a traitorous UNSC colonel, and it was without their power armor, so they were still pretty green. As Harvest was raging, the Spartans were rapidly deployed to deal with the threat, with Spartans Sam, Kelly, and John boarding a Covenant ship through a hole put into it by a Mac round. They succeeded in planting missiles on the ship's generators, however Sam's suit was breached by a plasma pistol overcharge shot and the vacuum sealing had failed. He stayed behind to detonate the missiles and destroy the ship, as the only other option available to him was to suffocate in space. This rather shook the Spartan IIs, who prior to this had felt invincible. Not that you can really blame them all that much for it. What teenager doesn't feel invincible, especially after one of them takes on 4 special operatives and puts them in body bags? In spite of this, it proved to the Spartans and humanity that the Covenant could be killed without needing to throw 13 of their ships at a single Covenant vessel. Over the course of the war, the Spartan IIs would be humanity's greatest asset. In many cases, they were the only thing turning a complete defeat into something that could be salvaged, and their operations cost the Covenant millions of lives. They were not frequently frontline soldiers, although given the nature of the war, they would see that role come up now and again. They were instead sent on high-priority missions to allow the rest of the UNSC military a fighting chance, be it assassinating key targets, blowing up facilities, or any number of other things. Since this video is more about the Spartans in general than any particular event, I won't go into too much detail, but honestly, just play Halo on Heroic or watch someone do it. You have the freedom to run and gun without worrying for your life about half the time, and the other half the time you have to be tactical, taking out the right enemies and making sure to make proper usage of your equipment and surroundings. That's basically how the Spartans operated in combat. They were gods of war capable of doing pretty much anything. They could tank hits no one else could, use a stealthy approach when necessary, and were proficient with anything you could arm them with. Spartans naturally came to be the stuff of legends for both the UNSC and the Covenant. For the UNSC's part, the program was declassified in 2547 to boost morale, as by this point the war was handily in the Covenant's favor. They left out the whole thing about kidnapping children to make them, but revealed the fact that humanity had these genetically enhanced super soldiers that were wiping the floor with the Covenant every time they went to battle. Even prior to that, though, their exploits were talked of with reverence among the armed forces at the very least, because people aren't going to stay quiet when they see a 7-foot-tall person flip a warthog over and then beat an alien to death with it. Oni was quite upset with both this and the declassification of the Spartan program in general, because being honest is anathema to them, but they were forced to recognize how important they were for keeping morale up. They did in response put into motion Directive 930, which is where you get that oh-so-iconic line from.
Spartans never died, George. They're just missing in action.
The directive states that when a Spartan has been confirmed as dead, they're to be listed as missing in action. The news of a Spartan dying would have been a horrible blow as humanity realized their most legendary soldiers were just as mortal as anyone else, so as to be kept quiet to the public. The Covenant, for their part, referred to the Spartans as demons. For most of them, this was a moniker of fear. A Spartan could show up in the dead of night and turn an entire Covenant base into a mass grave, something the aliens were rightfully terrified of. Elites called them much the same, but with a bit more respect respect. Their whole shtick is being the honorable warrior race, so they gave their soldiers their due credit. By the end of the Human Covenant War, only 16 Spartan IIs were known to have survived, although it was a little bit higher than that. Red Team, for example, wasn't among the known survivors as they were aboard the Spirit of Fire, which was listed as having been lost with all hands. But still, slowly but surely, they were dying, and despite their best efforts, they weren't enough on their own to prevent the UNSC from losing the war. There just wasn't enough Spartans, and when it came to space battles, their legendary battlefield prowess didn't matter all that much. The Master Chief as well as some other Spartan IIs blew up the Covenant station known as the Unyielding Hierophant, as well as a few hundred ships along with it. Unfortunately for humanity, when the Covenant's only response is to warp in another massive battle group of ships, the writing is on the wall that the Spartan IIs aren't enough. Humanity needed more of everything. Ships, men, equipment, and most important for what we're talking about, it needed more Spartans. Enter the Spartan III program. Created and directed by Colonel James Ackerson, who I regularly call James Ackerman by mistake because Attack on Titan has poisoned my brain, these were to be the next generations of Spartans improving on the IIs. While they were still created with the intent of making super special Spec Ops soldiers, eventually it was hoped that there would be over 100,000 Spartan IIIs to deploy more liberally to open engagements, which ultimately never came to pass. Instead of Oni going around kidnapping children from their families this time, they instead decided to get candidates from a different source, kidnapping orphans of war instead. An Oni officer would approach a child from a colony the Covenant destroyed that lost their parents, ask them if they'd like to get revenge on the people that murdered their family, and then take them away in an unmarked van to pump full of drugs and slap in some armor before telling them to go kill the aliens. The first batch was gathered by December 27, 2532, and by 2536 they were ready for deployment. Their augmentation procedures were far more advanced than those of the IIs. Acker's son and those on the project were able to refine it down due to both the existing data from the procedures beforehand, as well as advancements in technology ever since Halsey first turned children into weapons. This allowed for not only a far safer procedure, though still a painful one, but for a wider gene pool to be taken from. While they probably weren't going to be taking in anyone suffering from some sort of genetic illness, you no longer had to be baby Hercules to be selected to become a Spartan III. Many of the procedures were also chemically induced, rather than requiring some surgeon to go digging into a kid's organs and hoping the poor thing didn't fall apart like Humpty Dumpty when they were putting him back together again, further increasing survival odds. In fact, I don't believe anyone actually died from the augmentations. The gene requirements were still narrow, but selecting someone from outside of that range didn't mean they'd explode when augmented, it just wouldn't stick. Probably cripple them for life, but not kill them. That's better, I think. Their training was also headed by the Spartan II Kurt, and was said to be even more intensive than the Spartan II's training, so you know they were being put through the ringer to make them the best of the best. The Spartan IIIs of Gamma Company were also secretly given 3 additional drugs to increase their effectiveness. One was to prevent their bodies from ever going into shock, as well as make them deadlier in combat. It basically turned off the flight part of fight or flight. The only purpose of the other 2 drugs was to be regularly taken in order to prevent the first one from driving them into an animalistic rage. What came out of the Spartan III program were soldiers that in ideal circumstances could have become every bit as deadly as the IIs, and arguably more so. And if you think that's just favoritism for Halo Reach talking, how about you take the words of Fred and Kelly, both Spartan IIs themselves. Fred was incredibly impressed by how they performed, saying that even for a Spartan, their attacks were masterworks. Kelly briefly fought one of them as well, and the 3 was able to twist her arm and break free from an arm lock she puts them in. She did lay him out soon afterwards, but the 3 was almost immediately on the move again, and Kelly noted that if she did that maneuver to any normal person, she would have ripped their arm clean off. And if all that isn't enough for you, in one of the books, June was ripped out of a space station without a helmet and managed to fight his way back in without dying. Wasn't exactly feeling in top condition after the fact, but that's more than any of us could say in that situation. The issues for these Spartans' performance instead comes not from the quality of the 3s themselves, but from both the quality of their equipment as well as the situation surrounding their creation. See, Oni didn't strictly speaking want the next generations of Spartans to be just the 2s, but better. For all their effectiveness, the 2s were an incredibly expensive and time-consuming investment, each something the UNSC had little of as the Covenant pushed deeper and deeper. So while the increase in acceptable candidates and vastly increased survival rates were because of advancements of technology, almost everything else about the Spartan IIIs were because they weren't to be the legendary super soldiers. They were to be expendable. The majority of Spartan IIIs were equipped with semi-powered infiltration armor, or SPI armor. While it did give the wearer a boost to their strength and speed, it was nothing compared to the massive gains Mjolnir provided. I'm not talking something hypothetical like it's only a 250% boost compared to a 300% boost. That kind of thing would only matter to Hearts of Iron 4 players. The boost was so much lesser that normal people could wear SPI armor without their nervous system collapsing in on itself. While it had a built-in camouflage system, it lacked energy shielding, and the armor itself was far less durable than Mjolnir was. While one can make the argument this was done as a result of different operational doctrines between the 2s and 3s, the main reason this was the case was simply because of budget. You could make 100 suits of SPI armor for every suit of Mjolnir you made. End of story. At the end of the day, it was basically souped up ODST armor, and in fact, some of the tech used in it was also used in experimental ODST suits without too much modification being needed. And just to put the cherry on top, the 3s were oftentimes as young as 11 when they fought the Covenant. The Spartan 2s were at least in their teens by the time war broke out, and by the end of the war were hitting the 40s and 50s. Spartan 3s didn't even have that small blessing. These were children even more so than the 2s, and they were thrown into hell. To make matters worse for them, many of the missions Spartan 3s were sent on were oftentimes the kind of missions that resulted in a 100% casualty rate. For reference, there were 3 main companies of Spartan 3s, each with 300 members minimum. There were Alpha, Beta, and Gamma of which had 330. A planned Delta Company was going to be trained, but then the war ended, so they weren't really needed anymore. Alpha Company was the first one deployed in 2536, and for the first 9 months of their service, they performed spectacularly. Then they went on Operation Prometheus to destroy a Covenant shipyard, which they did, and every single one of them died doing it. Some were taken off for being especially valuable operatives, but everyone else was thrown into the meat grinder. Beta Company would suffer a similar fate. They had some time of absolutely stellar service against the Covenant, but because Spartan 3s were designed with suicide missions in mind, most of them came to an abrupt end at Operation Torpedo. Same case as before, particularly skilled members were taken off the mission, everyone else sallied forth and died. On the bright side, a whole 2 of them managed to survive this time. That's something. That is technically infinitely more 3s than survived the last time, which isn't great because last time was 0, but, you know, better than nothing. Gamma Company, the one that received the angry drug I mentioned earlier, managed to mostly survive the Human Covenant War. Training for them began on July 9th, 2545, and this was a rush job even by the standards of the 3s. They were, as normal, all around 6 years old, but the UNSC needed soldiers a lot quicker than the Gammas had time to grow. So they all had puberty artificially induced in them in addition to various growth hormones to help things along. It did largely work, although because they turned a bunch of 7-year-olds into biological adults in the span of about 9 months, the Gammas had to relearn basic coordination. In spite of that absolutely horrific opening, these lots didn't have nearly the amount of casualties as the other companies, and many would ultimately survive the war. Oni had to figure out how to use them since they all had that angry juice in their brains, but they were eventually to be put into positions that didn't require too much public exposure to keep that little rage serum thing a secret. The preparations for Delta Company's formation were all ready, but as I said, the war ended before it became a necessity to form it. Despite the 3s being used as expendable shock troops, particularly promising 3s were taken and put into separate units to keep around for missions other than suicide charges. One such unit was the Headhunters. These were 3s that managed to complete at least 2 of their assigned missions. They were taken off their respective companies and put into a separate unit whose job was to go behind enemy lines on the worst of missions. They were also given specialized training and put into squads with further effort put into ensuring they could all work together. Some of them were given SPI armor that incorporated many of the features of Mjolnir, such as energy shielding, but it was still inferior to Mjolnir and casualty rates remained high. A number of 3s were lucky enough, however, to be pulled out of their respective companies and given proper Mjolnir armor. These ones were naturally the best of the best and were treated much the same as Spartan 2s, given missions that could feasibly be completed without guaranteeing their deaths. They were treated so similarly, in fact, that many of their actions were attributed to the 2s, since the general public wasn't really aware of the distinction between the Spartan generations. The 3s, for their part, allowed this to happen without much complaint, probably because they were all war orphans who just wanted to kill aliens. You can even see some of these fellows in Reach, though rather darkly you only see what's left of their last stand. All those corpses in Lone Wolf? Yeah, those were some of these guys. And of course, Noble Team, which was apparently just its own thing. It was entirely separate from the Spartan 3 command structure, being its own team under the UNSC Army's jurisdiction. They got Mjolnir armor, they didn't have the same restrictions as other Spartans, which was why Emil got to have a collection of Covenant weapons, and they even got to have a 2 on their team. Fellas, I am once again asking for an F in the chat for George. It was always a 6-man team with another Spartan being rotated in if one fell, with a special exception for Emil, who had a Spartan rotated into his place if they were fighting insurrectionists, because he was apparently such a brutal monster to them that the agency that kidnapped children to make super soldiers out of said, "Hey man, you're going too far." What the hell did he do to them? Carter and Kat were the only 2 remaining original members of Noble Team by the time of Reach, and by the end of Reach, the only remaining member of Noble Team period was June. Don't need to go too into the specifics here, just go play Halo Reach. That's all that needs to be said. It's the best Halo game, go play it. Overall, the 3s were easily the most tragic of the Spartans. Halsey, for all her monstrosity, at least attempted in some small ways to give the 2s a measure of comfort and guidance. She felt guilt over what she did and for every 2's death, and even with all that report nonsense about humanity about to throw itself back to the Dark Ages, she never truly convinced herself it was ultimately a necessary sacrifice to create the Spartan IIs. Meanwhile, Ackerson threw the 3s into the wood chipper that was the Covenant to try and jam it with their bodies. The credit they might have gotten was oftentimes given to the 2s or the Spartans as a whole without any distinction, and the only true exception I could find of this was a statue dedicated to Noble Team built on Reach after resettlement began. And last but not least, because the original Project Orion was such a flop, we have the Spartan IVs, also known as why first impressions matter, because I genuinely think they're a natural continuation of the program, but Palmer sassing the Chief when they first met poisoned so many people's perception of them. The Spartan IV project was a very simple one, and indeed calls back to the original Orion project. Take young candidates that show promise as well as veterans, all of whom are volunteers, and turn them into demigods. This time it was headed by 2 Spartans, Admiral Musa, who was one of the Spartan II washouts but managed to survive, and June, of Noble Team fame. Ackerson was going to head the project initially with Halsey as a subordinate, but then he died and Halsey was arrested. Oops. The Spartan IVs led to the creation of the Spartan Operations branch of the UNSC military, a separate entity from any existing one whose purview was what else but the deployment and overseeing of Spartans. There was some hesitation about the program, both for the necessity of it and because of what the recruitment was like. The necessity part was just because the Human Covenant War was over, so did we really need to invest more time and money into creating another group of Spartans? For the recruitment part, when you could take from children, you could make sure they were obedient through copious amounts of brainwashing. Taking from volunteers amongst the military, though, meant that your future super soldiers capable of tearing through tanks like a knife through butter might have all sorts of baggage. They might decide that deserting and joining the other side might be the right thing to do. But in the end, the program was given the go-ahead, with the first class of Spartan IVs graduating on January 7th, 2553, with a second and much larger class beginning in 2554. As an aside, Spartan IVs are generally referred to by their last names rather than a number, since erasing the identity of who they were before they were taken isn't a part of the program anymore. Congratulations, IVs, through the sacrifice of those who came before you, you have earned the right of basic human decency. Their augmentations, unlike the previous programs, don't require incredibly strict genetic criteria to be met. As long as you have the ability and promise, you can become a Spartan. The procedures, as far as I could find, are also far more forgiving on the body, without a casualty rate or even a washout rate for that matter. Over the course of 3 weeks, the surgeries were undertaken, and at the end of it came out a super soldier. Of course, due to the changed nature of these Spartans and their augmentations, there were downsides in terms of how powerful they were. The augmentations, while certainly powerful, were nothing like the ones of the 2s and 3s. They were far less intensive, yes, but also far less potent for it. They also require regular checkups to ensure everything is sitting well in the recipient's body. The Spartan Operations branch requires not only 2 hours of daily specialty training, but a further 2 hours daily of physical conditioning and augmentation monitoring. While certainly cheaper than the 2s were, all things considered, a Spartan IV is an investment you need to keep a constant eye on. Unlike the 2s and 3s where once all is said and done you could pretty much ignore them, Spartan IVs require constant doctor visits and more to ensure their augmentations are taking properly. Now, how about I just cut to the chase and get a nice argument going in the comments between 343 Halo fans and Bungie Halo fans, of which I am both, so I have no true stake in the matter. Are Spartan IVs equal to 2s or 3s? The answer is both no and yes. As I said, their augmentations aren't equal. I don't think this is a bad thing lore-wise, because a natural part of the program being made public and more widespread would involve not killing everyone who wanted to become a Spartan, or kidnapping children. They're mass-producing Spartans in a way that's not born out of desperation. The UNSC can afford for them to have a little bit less kick. But it does mean that out of armor, a 2 or a 3 is going to ragdoll a 4. But in comes Gen 2 Mjolnir armor. This was a massive upgrade from what the previous Spartans wore, and when wearing it, a 4 is in many ways an equal to their previous generations. It's why in Halo 5, for all the travesty that game's single player was, Locke wasn't folded by the Chief in all of 3 seconds. Of course, I don't see the reason why the remaining 2s and 3s can't be given an equivalent so they can keep being the best, so, you know, there's that. Seems like that would also be a logical step to take, which maybe they have and I just haven't found that bit of lore. Or maybe they haven't because something banished, something endless. There is also the simple matter of experience. The twos were formed when humanity was about to tear itself apart, and the threes were formed during the Human Covenant War. Those who remained after it saw conflict the likes of which the fours never did as Spartans, and that's something that can only ever be rectified with time. If nothing else though, how about I just let Edward Buck tell you how he sees the respective Spartan generations. When he was an ODST, people said if he was any better he'd be a Spartan, and he fought through almost the entirety of the war. You can safely assume this man knows what he's talking about. He also is a Spartan 4 now, so that's some pretty first-hand experience. In the novel New Blood, Buck talks about the Spartan generations and likens them back to Greek myth. He calls the Spartan 2s not just gods, but titans, towering above every single person around. They were heads and shoulder above everyone else, which is also a literal statement since they were tall. They could do things normal people couldn't even hope to imagine achieving. Quite a bit of humility coming from a former ODST with that whole rivalry thing they had. The threes, meanwhile, were the gods. Not quite as good as the twos, but in his own words again, their capabilities were just within the realm of imagination, certainly still far above what anyone else could hope to do. The fours, meanwhile, are the demigods, the children of the gods. By his own admission, you could feasibly see a 4 and not recognize them as a Spartan outright. You'd see them as an Olympian athlete who could fold you like a pretzel, to be sure, but without a comprehensive examination, they weren't outwardly that much different from normal people. But on the inside, they were still special, someone capable of things no mortal could possibly do. For my opinion, which I will make you sit through because it's my video and I have that power, I think he's right, though perhaps not in the way you immediately think of given the whole Titans, Gods, Demigods comparison. The twos were the greatest Spartans. They helped train the future generations, and while not the original template, the future ones were all based on Halsey's work. And hell, Master Chief. Don't really need to explain that one, do I? But as much as it was from their abilities, they're also the greatest because of circumstance. The UNSC and Oni treated them as almost sacred assets. A Spartan 2 is not something to be wasted. In no ways were they expendable. They were the ones with the legends built up around them, the myths about them being completely unkillable no matter what, the heroes that would save humanity from the Covenant. The threes, meanwhile, certainly had the potential to be better than them, but that wasn't their intended purpose. They were simply to be thrown into the fire to complete the mission. Coming back alive was just a bonus. They weren't treated as a prized possession to be used sparingly. They were thrown at a problem in relatively speaking massive numbers until the problem went away. The fours, meanwhile, come from you and me. Regular people who've got the guts and drive to become something greater. Regardless of how fans might feel about them, in universe, they're Spartans at the end of the day, capable of feats you and I could never hope to perform. They still give people hope that humanity can face the dangers of the universe and come out on top. The fours will probably never have the in-universe legendary reputations that the previous generations have, but they don't need it.
And if worse comes to worse, if HighCom declares Corruptor, is it really going to make a difference for you if a 4 is hunting you down instead of a 2? I thought not.
So that, everyone, was the Spartans, the ultimate super soldier in all of fiction, and no, I'm not willing to debate that. No amount of versus power level scaling arguments are going to undo the nostalgia that's been building in me since I picked up Halo 3 for the first time. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You were the horrific, abhorrent procedures to my Spartan 2s and 3s, giving life to something that in an ideal world never should have come about. And thank you to Thunderpsyker for doing that lovely line read for me. It was very kind of him after I freeballed all over his Halo game night. Look, Gary, there I am. It was good fun and a phenomenal pair of videos. Check them out. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Did you know that Thelvadam, prior to becoming the Arbiter, had devised a list of methods of surviving Spartans? Not killing, pointedly, just surviving them. Look up Spartan Rule 34 for more information. Sex joke.